Hi, my name's Jaime Acosta, and I'm going to be presenting joint research between ARL and UTEP focused on repeatable experimentation for cybersecurity moving target defense. There are many novel defense technologies in existence today that focus on thwarting attackers in active ways. For example, intrusion detection prevention may identify anomalies and then issue alerts or start dropping packets. Moving target defense attempts to continuously change what could be considered an attack surface by modifying IP addresses, shifting addressing for processes, or even migrating processes to different systems. Cyber deception maybe use honeypots to attract an adversary away from a real system in order to learn their strategies, collect data, and more. However, lacking are technologies that will aid in allowing repeating experimental evaluation of these technologies, which is critical for improvement in comparison, among many others. In some cases, even if algorithms and code are provided openly, there's still dependencies on specific operating systems, applications, libraries that'll become out of date or otherwise unattainable. Additionally, setup and configuration are sometimes lost due to documentation constraints, such as page limits. Our goal with this work targets these issues by developing software based on open source that allows researchers and analysts to package virtual machines, configurations, and settings related to experiments with a portable tool. We also focus on efficient simultaneous executions, which is necessary for characterizing behavior rather than just simply basing results on one-shot executions. Our ultimate goal is then to be able to determine which defense technologies are better suited in different situations. For example, might be the case that algorithm A works really well in a larger scenario with mobile nodes, but algorithm B might work better with smaller static topologies. In short, we provide these three main contributions in our work. So first, our repeatable experimentation system, or RES for short, is available on GitHub. It runs on Linux, Mac, Windows. Second, we provide a case study, namely where we create an experiment in RES using a modified MTD implementation from the web. We evaluate the implementation against port scans, and then we provide the results using different shuffle times. And third, we analyze the parallelization capabilities of RES and their impact on the experiment results. So RES is built using a modular design. On the left side, you'll notice the front-end interfaces. Users can interact with RES using a GUI by writing scripts or running shell commands. In the back end, these all interact with the RES engine. Every experiment consists of a configuration, which is stored in JSON, and it contains information about the plugin selection. For example, if you want to use VMware versus VirtualBox, it also has paths, virtual machine names, startup commands, the number of simultaneous runs, and several others. These can be configured either through the GUI or straight just modifying the JSON. The managers interact with externals, including Guacamole for remote desktop viewing, and hypervisors for virtual machine manipulations, including starting, stopping, packaging of virtual machines. Here you can see the user interface. On the top left is the experiment selection and configuration pane. And here users can create and manage experiments. In this case, you can see we've added 13 VMs and 2 material files. We also set this experiment to run 5 clones or simultaneous runs. The bottom window shows a VirtualBox configuration view. Here we've disabled remote desktop, and we've also set up 8 internal interfaces. It's worth noting that these 8 interfaces are isolated for each simultaneous run. So for example, the Ubuntu 18 machine in run number 1 is not going to be able to interact in any way with the Ubuntu 18 machine in run number 2. Finally, the top window shows the Experiment Actions tab, where users can actually create clones and run the experiments. In our case study, we modified a publicly available MTD implementation. We use software-defined networking, specifically Open vSwitches and a RIU controller using the Mininet tool. Virtual IP addresses are used to communicate across nodes, and these are available through a name lookup, so real IPs cannot be used directly. The controller handles this conversion, and also on a specific interval or a shuffle time, which we call it, the controller will clear out any virtual to real IP mappings. Also at this time, flows from any untrusted networks will be dropped, and they'll have to be reestablished. We created a scenario using MiniEdit that consists of two subnets. On the left are the trusted entities, and on the right are the untrusted entities. We had H1 listen on 20 ports, so we used just a simple netcat to do this. And then both H2, which is a trusted entity, and H3, which is an untrusted entity, both run Nmap scans against H1. So for Nmap, we just used the defaults. We didn't add any additional arguments. So again, as mentioned in the previous slide, the controller will force S3 to re-resolve and reestablish any connections to the trusted entity on every shuffle. But the trusted entity doesn't have to do this. In this scenario, we limited the virtual IP address space to a total of 255 possible addresses. These were set to nodes in a random way, so it was definitely possible, and it did occur where a node was reassigned the same address more than once. To create a res file, we first created an Ubuntu virtual machine and installed Mininet. Since res is capable of running startup scripts within VMs, we also wrote a script that would instantiate both the RIU controller and another for instantiating the Mininet scenario. So in res, we added a new experiment, calling it MTD RIU study, as you can see in the figure below. And we added the virtual machine using the context menu and the res GUI. And afterwards, we added startup commands to the VM. So we indicated that these commands should be started 60 seconds after the machine is booted. These commands are all part of VirtualBox, specifically vbox manage. So it's really nice if you're already familiar with those. So this part of the process is probably the most difficult, but once you create them, it's essentially just fine-tuning to make sure that these commands do essentially what you want. The nice thing too is once you create them, then you can export the entire experiment and everything's going to be preserved. And since it's tied to vbox manage, even if you move it to another system, you won't have to change these commands. So for this experiment, there were a total of 6 startup commands. The first one runs the controller, the RIU controller. The second one waits for 10 seconds to allow the controller to set up its mapping and anything else it needs to boot. And then afterward, we call Mininet with the topology that was showed in the previous slide. Then we let the scenario run for an hour. You can see, and then we kill it, and finally we copy the results from the virtual machine to a directory on the host machine. So yeah, when we run the experiment, we have 10 copies that run at once, and when they're all done, they all copy again the results to the host into a different directories, where there's no overwriting of information. So we wanted to get an idea of whether the manual runs provided different results than using the simultaneous runs of res that we just configured in the previous slide. So for the manual runs, we actually ran one at a time without res, and then we manually went into each VM, pulled out the results, and it was pretty time consuming. For the automated mechanisms I mentioned before, we just use the experiment that we created on previous slides. So the Nmap scans run slightly different when scanning across and within a subnet. So we tested both cases, and the results are interesting. You can see that the numbers are pretty close. There is variation across the runs. This is mainly due to Nmap's non-deterministic scanning logic. But one thing that is interesting again is that you can actually see that we can still observe ranges of times. So that is, we can actually characterize the behavior across several runs. So then from there we moved on to our next analysis. So we wanted to characterize, based on shuffle time, how long it would take an untrusted entity to scan H1 and how many ports would be identified. So we use res to execute 10 simultaneous runs. And as you can see here, on average, with a shuffle time of 20 seconds, took roughly 24 minutes, and half of the ports were detected. However, you can also see that based on the maximum, there was a case when all 20 ports were found, but it took 36 minutes. With a shuffle time of 50 seconds, the time and the ports identified increased slightly, as you can see here. And you can see that the trend follows until we set the shuffle time to 230 seconds, at which time all ports are identified across the board. So we measured total CPU usage during the single and parallel executions of scenarios. Shown here, there's a base load for VirtualBox, the operating system, and others. Then after a short while, when the scenario starts, there's a spike. It's essentially Mininet starting and the controller setting up the initial mappings. Afterwards, the load increases and stays within roughly a 12% range throughout. And this is when Nmap scans are actually executing. Towards the end, you'll see a drop, and that's where the scenario shuts down and the CPU usage goes back to the initial load. We see similar results on the right side. So when analyzing the scenario with MTD, of course the Y-scales here are a little bit different, but one thing of interest on the figures on the right is when we used MTD, you'll notice that the load is overall less when the scenario is executing. So we looked into this. It turns out that there's this is due to wait delays in the Nmap scans caused by the controller dropping established flows. So that was interesting. Also, as a side note, so we initially set up and ran this experiment on a somewhat beefy laptop running Windows 10, and we found that the CPU and even memory were constantly being maxed out with our experiment. So what we did is we used Res's export feature to create our standalone .res file, and then we moved it over, just a simple transfer to a higher end server running Ubuntu 18, and we installed Res, which was actually pretty straightforward. And after that, the transition was pretty seamless. We just imported the standalone file. We even increased the number of simultaneous runs, and everything worked without any change to the configuration, and those are the results that you're seeing here. So as I mentioned before, the Res tool is available for download on GitHub, and as is the experiment that I presented in the slides. The links are in the paper, and the next step in this work is to develop more experiments using other algorithms, and then to actually do some comparative analyses and eventually develop a decision support system. So thank you very much for your attention. Here I provide my information if you'd like to contact me for more.